All right, so welcome everybody to our monthly ACC Emergers peer group call. I'm John Brewer, president of the Billings Chamber of Commerce in Montana. And so we can record your participation on this call. If you wouldn't mind sending me an email just to let me know you're out there. It's John, John, at billingschamber.com. Very fortunate to have Michael Manis with us today, calling in from New York. So we've got New York, Texas, Rapid City, Montana, and some places in between on the call today. So Michael is a leading thinker in innovation, media, and transformational impact of the internet, and is co-founder of Subculture. I know a few of us heard Michael's presentation in Little Rock at the ACCE board meeting last month, and we're so impressed with the data and how it tied in to the catalytic leadership discussion that we've had the last couple of years that we thought that this would make for a great introductory call for many, as well as a refresher for those of us that heard it last month. So just a little bit about Michael. He became the first ever innovator in residence at the Harvard Business School. The position was created as part of the digital initiative at Harvard, an effort to bring together leading scholars and practitioners to explore the reinvention of business in a digital, networked, and media-rich environment. Michael's exploration and research investigates why innovation fails or thrives in business cultures. Prior to his current role, Michael was the Vice President of Journalism and Media Innovation at the Knight Foundation. And before his work at Knight, Michael was the Vice President of Design and Innovation for USA Today and Gannett. He is on the Board of Trustees for the Museum in Washington, D.C., a really cool place if you've been there before, and a former member of the Advisory Board for IDEO, one of the world's leading design companies, and on the Media Advisory Board for the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City. And a very impressive resume, Michael. So we're going to turn things over to you. And again, just a reminder to everybody, we'll keep this conversational. If you have questions as Michael presents, please feel free to chime in. And then at the end, we'll also reserve some time for question and answer as well. So, Michael.
Great. Thank you, John. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. And as John noted, please, it's a little difficult always on the phone, and I'll get going. But don't hesitate if I hear anybody just, ask a question, I'll pause and you can ask it. So I want to make sure that anything that happens throughout this that you feel okay interrupting, because I don't mind whatsoever and happy to engage on a point-by-point basis for the slides. There's actually a lot of material, so I'll move a little quickly and to leave room for discussion on this. And I'll tell you a little of the genesis of this work was done for information around hiring the next executive for the association, and to give some insight into what members and specifically executives of chambers were looking for in leadership. The approach that we use on this is what's called human-centered design. It's been around since the 70s, but more recently gaining traction. The way this works is it's a qualitative approach, so this is not quantitative in the sense of doing big surveys. We actually find this to be more accurate than a lot of survey work, or when we do survey work, it completely corresponds to what we found. So the approach is doing very specific interviews with a very different group of people. So we interviewed very small chambers, large metro chambers, people who executives that were 6 months into their role, executives that have been there for 20 years. So a real plethora of different experiences. What you find in the presentation, the approach, is that we're looking for the common and the uncommon. So we have all these different types of chamber executives, and when we found something that really resonated amongst them, that's what you'll see here. So these aren't outliers. These are things that we thought were very that were commonly shared, and insights that we pulled through synthesis on that. So that gives you a little bit of background. So I'll go ahead and jump in, hopefully here. Oh, I'm sorry. No. Oh, can I get slides okay?
Yes, I can see it. National trends and local impact.
Okay,
That's
great.
good.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and jump in. One of the things that we found, and this is part of our research at Harvard, so this is a little macro, but we're seeing across the United States a major decline in all types of institutions. This is something that the chambers are wrestling with a lot of other organizations. You'll see it in political institutions. Obviously, this is kind of more well known. That if you look across the spectrum, the decline in confidence and everything, but the Supreme Court, which also has a slight decline, but not nearly as extreme as the others, you're seeing confidence of only some and great deal being almost cut in half. You also see this in every way, in community, in the left, these are, a little smaller graphs, public schools, labor, media, big business, everything, there's a real distrust in institutions and organizations. And I think what we found is this is very reflective in the chamber world as well. And the replacement of that, and this is one of the disruptions of the internet and the rise of social media, is that the trust is down in institutions and businesses, but peer trust is up and expertise is up. And we found this throughout chamber executives, where they were talking to each other, they were coming up with solutions on their own, or networking with peers to figure out what the best way and best approach was for things. So again, you see this sense of decline in that, and you might be seeing that in your own communities, where it might be a little harder for membership. People aren't joining, societies and like the Kiwanis and clubs like they used to. And really what we find is this is an impact on a post-geographic world. And what I mean by that is before the internet, you really had a lock on the local business community. To network, to engage with each other, they had to go through you as a medium. And that was a great model for you to own that networking power, and as well as be the center of that in the community. But post-internet, what happens is there's what we call the rise of communities of interest. This is the ability for anyone to find like-minded people outside of the geography. So you're not limited by geography anymore. And also, there's new types of businesses that are taking advantage of this. There's millennials are launching different kinds of chamber organizations. They're connecting in national and international ways. They're not defined by their local geography. Businesses are not defined by their local geography necessarily anymore. So this is a dramatic shift that we're seeing across the country, as well as the decline of institutions. So that's a little macro setting. That's a little space of what's happening. And what we found is, in our research, we wanted to identify what we saw were key aspects of what the local executives were experiencing across the chamber environment. The one that was really striking to us was the notion that we call the lonely leader. One of the things that you all have probably experienced yourself is being an executive at the chamber, or the executive at the chamber, is there's no one else like you in the town or city. You're singular in what you do because you're the only one and you're the only chamber in town. And also, not only that, but the notion is that you're one of a kind, and also, even though you might have a different chamber experience, each community is different. Everyone faces different challenges. There's a sense of isolation that we found with that. We see, and you'll see this increasingly, that you're being called upon to do a lot more in your role than you were historically, and that leaders, because they're lonely, are creating these workarounds to connect with each other through Facebook and other opportunities to try to ease this kind of sense of loneliness. And a really great quote from our research was this, essentially, which is, the soil is different in every community. which is not only many of you have maybe been executives at other cities and other chambers, and you recognize that when you move someplace else, it is a lot different. And we heard that loud and clear from everyone, that it's a double kind of isolating job. You're one of a kind in your community, and your community is different than every community. There's also an expectation here that there's a front line, that you're on the front line of a shifting workforce. We heard a lot of conversation around millennials and new technologies and how they're altering the landscape. And one of the things about that that's important is we heard chamber executives that were really struggling with this, and that their businesses and the town were struggling with it. They're having a hard time at getting millennials involved. And also, though, we did hear a little bit scary conversation, for me at least, in the work that I do, in the sense that everyone's kind of waiting around for the millennials to be, quote unquote, professional or engaged in the community, and kind of a, sit back, wait and see attitude, which is fairly dangerous, coming from an industry like newspapers, where everyone waited for everyone to all of a sudden start subscribing and no one ever did again. That's something to really watch in this, but definitely a sense that there's a fundamental shift in what's going on, and businesses are struggling with it, and chambers are struggling to figure out what to do with it. And this is that quote that I have from this. This is what we hear a lot in different industries. When the blank generation grows up, they will fall in line with our way of thinking, expecting the generation to shift to historical models, which has simply not been the case for a long time. The other aspect of this is that we found people are really being thrust into a consulting role for their chamber members. They're doing a lot of research, a lot of heavy lifting, trying to understand emerging technologies, the business climate. They have people coming in asking them, how do I compete in a global marketplace? And this is especially true in smaller chambers, where there's a lack of expertise in the urban setting necessarily that gives them access to any insight. So a real shift in the expectation that chamber executives are doing a lot of work to keep themselves up to date on these trends. Also, as a chamber executive, that the member investment and the membership models feel a bit tired. There's lots of people experimenting with lots of different things throughout the system, but that is a constant refrain that, the membership models are flat to falling, and that you have to do lots of different work to kind of maintain revenue streams. Also, the rise of regionalism, with the hard-pressedness of the budgets and time, it's very difficult for a lot of chamber executives to go to things on the East Coast or West Coast. And there's a real sense that regional meetings are important, that regional networking is actually growing, that regionality allows for some duplication and understanding better in the communities, and that it makes a difference when you've got these, the big metros out there, and a lot of the smaller smaller chambers have a hard time, this is like convening even out of the state. But the sense is that people want something really close to home or closer to home where they can network. This is something we heard very loud and clear. They, both for the ACCE and going on the local chambers, is that they don't feel they're diverse enough. They see it in meetings, and this is both gender and people of color. We heard a lot of people, especially women executives, who said, often I'm the only woman in the room, and that there was a real need as chambers expand to smaller businesses that are often minority owned, how you interact with that and build models to incorporate them and get them in as members. And finally, I think one of the things that's important around this is it's not just enough, maybe 15 years ago, you're an expert at running an association, and that's what you did, and that was the expectation for it. But we're really shifting. One of the stories we heard were, when political issues are happening, like issues in North Carolina, issues in Indianapolis, when there's a shooting like that happened in Orlando, that the national press are calling on chamber executives to have a point of view, to have sound bites, to have interviews. So all of a sudden you're thrust in the middle of a crisis management. You have to worry about public relations. You're expected to be like a consultant. Your members need you. So this is a very expanded role from historically what has happened at chambers, where your expertise and your professionalism was around running the association. But that's not, people expect a lot more from you from that, and we really heard that from the executive. So I'll pause for a minute there and ask, if there's any questions around that or any comments, considering that should be somewhat reflective of how you feel about yourselves in your roles.
This is Kelly. I have a couple of observations, and I want to look at the slides again. The two things that popped out at me as I'm planning travel to attend conferences, whether it's for ACCE, the U.S. Chamber, it's what you said about the East and the West. Even if you're in the Mid-South like I am, it's becoming increasingly harder to navigate travel schedules because of the reduction of flights and then the cost of hotels and flights. It's just, there's got to be a better model out there to join together industry clusters for learning experiences than having to go to a conference.
Yeah.
And I love the one-on-one, but it's getting tougher to make that happen.
Yeah.
The other observation had to do with the money, and well, I think that's spot on. And we're seeing our business model continue to shift, with our dues revenue is staying the same, but the number of members is reducing, and that's a slippery slope because that only makes up 38% of our budget. The rest is through non-dues revenue. So we have a smaller pool. We're growing the dollars, but when does that bell curve shift and we prevent running, becoming the fried potato kind of, where we're always chasing the next dollar? I mean, and we're always sizzling. It's kind of scary.
Yeah. No, we definitely, that your points on that, we definitely heard, and that's why I named it the money chase, where if you're, chasing your own tail all the time, the danger is when that keeps declining, you have to run faster and faster, and of course for less and less, right? So that's not a good model to be in. And there's a lot of experimentation going on around that. But we also heard from people saying, I don't have a lot of diversity. I got large businesses writing large checks. That could change at any moment. And, how do we become more efficient around membership? How do we offer more for membership? Those are all things that we really heard, and especially in the smaller chambers. The membership declines that you're feeling, they don't have the staffing levels to necessarily create a diverse approach to fundraising, and so that's a little difficult there too.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody else before we move on? Okay. Well, this is a little bit of what we heard reflected around these for ACCE members. So this is what it was like for the what we heard, the thoughts around the ACCE. Right off the bat, people give a really high marks to ACCE on being smart, prompt, and professional. A question, though, exists is there's a new generation of leaders coming in that are a lot different than the past. And is ACCE really aware of this going on, and are they pushing for the sense of a fundamental shift in the workforce? ACCE is seen as a facilitator for networking, but that was for members only. We actually talked to people who weren't ACCE members, and we also found chamber leaders forming their own solutions in groups. There's some workarounds. There's a lot of, and some of you may be members of robust Facebook groups You know, we heard leaders talking about, I love my Facebook group because I don't have to worry about my board seeing it, for example. And so it's great when you can go to the conference for ACCE and you have those geographic gatherings, as we were talking before. But there's also a lot of people building their own. The Horizons work at ACCE was very highly regarded. People love the training. They love the data of the Horizons projects. It was highly valued and very well regarded in terms of the insights and the approach. And people wanted more of things like that. We heard from people who had just recently become chamber presidents, and they were really, they heaped superlatives on the ACCE for really helping them say, I've never done this before, and I'm walking into this, you know, I came from a different type of background. I've never been a chamber executive before, and the ACCE really had their back. They gave them lots of information and were really supportive of that transition. There's a real sense that the digital presence of ACCE could be improved. As I mentioned before, a lot of chamber executives are doing research and work on their own, and finding the content on ACCE is a little difficult. And there's a real sense of personal touch, but they are working hard to find that information, and a better digital layout and resource would be helpful. What we found really distinctly is if an ACC member had some type of personal connection with an executive there, the relationship was very strong, and ACC was very well regarded. But we also talked to people who were outliers in ACCE, who were members who had never done anything with it, and they had no connection to it. And what we saw was there's a real need for personal outreach for engagement with ACCE. So the higher engagement was reflected because of better social contact. So that was just a little brief thing around experience with ACCE, and now I'll dive into what we found of the expectations of leadership. I'll pause for a minute if there's any questions or comments. This section. Great. So one of the things we heard loud and clear is that ACC members want someone in the leadership position who's in touch with the new economy, meaning the emergent digital space and what that disruption means, that they want someone experienced in that, as well as someone who can get some idea of where everything's going. Everyone's struggling with this, not just in chamber world, but across industry and business in the United States. And that's something that they feel they need thought leadership on, as well as someone with experience in that as well. And that's reflective in this notion that ACC is a valuable resource, but it's a resource that you have to activate. So as a member, you have to raise your hand and ask for help. What we found is, instead of waiting for requests, there's a need for ACC to be on top of it. And I'll give you an example. The happened in Orlando, that chamber executive called Oklahoma City's president to talk about what I should do. He was getting calls from the National Press Corps about how it impacted business, what it meant for Orlando, all those things. And so he needed to reach out, and he had an association with the Oklahoma City chamber, so he knew where to go. But in this instance, that could have been a great opportunity for ACC to lean in and say, we heard this happen in Orlando. Here's what you're going to need to be prepared for. Let us get you connected to people. So instead of waiting for a response or request, that they could lean in and lean forward and push out, not only in that way, but push out material more often. And again, the notion of a track record of diversity. This diversity was a really big issue throughout all of this. And they wanted someone who had a proven track record and improving diversity and engaging across that across the spectrum of people to engage with that, to bring in. There's a real sense, and this is a real hallmark of Mick, I think, that what we call full stack leadership. And what we mean by that is the ability to understand the needs and issues for chambers of all different sizes. That you're comfortable talking to, a smaller chamber as well as a metro, that you understand regional differences, that you have a personal connection, and not to just focus, say, on the metros exclusively or medium and small chambers, but really to be able to move across that. And that's something that we heard Mick was really, and everyone referred to him as Mick, was a really important idea around that they really enjoyed that. It was really important to them, and they wanted to see that in the new leader. And this again is this is the bridging the chasm. Is they know where you've been, where you're at, and the comments around, for example, fundraising. There's a whole different game to be played. There's a whole different world to explore, and there's a big gap between where you're at and where you need to go. A very different past and future, and people really want a leader to help them build that bridge across the gap and understand that, and figure out where to go. So that's where that past experience of the new digital economy comes from, and expertise and a vision as well. And divergent thinking is something that we've seen. This is really important, and it's across not only this position but most industries, is that it's going to require a lot of novel solutions in the face of this continuously disruptive economy. How am I thinking ahead? How am I thinking differently? How am I generating new ideas? And people really want leaders in the organization to be able to provide that. A real sense of we understand what we're embarking on. It's going to be difficult, and I've got to come up with lots of novel solutions to make it happen. This aligns with what we've seen. This is research. There's a book coming out that I recommend to everyone. It's Harvard-based, and I've seen the research on it. It's called The CEO Next Door, and it talks about, they've done a longitudinal study, I believe, of at least 10 years, of looking at CEOs who are successful versus the ones that are more successful than others. And what they found is that it's what we call the rise of the introverted leader. And the introverted leader, because the problems are so diverse and challenging and different, what they're finding is the CEOs who are the most successful are ones who listen to a lot of different ideas. And there's multiple studies on this now, so we know that these traits are true, and that's why they call it the CEO next door. It's not the image that you have of the CEO coming and saying, I have the solution, I have the right strategy, I'm going to fix this. Tends to not do as well as someone who's saying, I have approaches, I want to understand more, I want to learn before I make any decisions, I want lots of different opinions before I make a decision, I'm listening. And what we found is there's a great study on this where it shows that introverted leaders with extroverted management, meaning others around them that are extroverted, have a much higher performance than people who are extroverted leaders, and even with introverted managers. Extroverted leaders with introverted managers and introverted leaders with extroverted managers both do better than average, but the introverted leader is who listens and has those extroverted, it performs better. And we're seeing this really specifically in the digital economies where, Gates, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, all of those people are introverts. And one of the recommendations is if you happen to be an extrovert, it doesn't mean you can't be a great leader. It's just that the extrovert tends not to listen as well. And not any one person right now can have all the solutions because it's just too complex. The emerging economies are much more complex than we've had in the past, and there's no one way fits all, one strategy fits all solution. So therefore, it's a really important for this leader and for your yourselves to make sure that you're putting a lot of time listening to different points of view. And finally, there's a couple things here. This is my research around innovation and transformation of organizations. And what we find is this real arc of organizations that happens, which is, and you'll see this even in your communities. There's a business that starts as a divergent idea. For example, Henry Ford, with making an automobile cheap enough for the masses. He builds an emergent team. In Ford's case, he brought together a soup can manufacturer, the head of the largest butchery in Chicago, journalists, all these new people for the first time, from very diverse walks of life. There's an operational growth, so it gets together, they build the factory, they make the assembly line, and then you get to sustain and defend, where you are a organization that's doing well or a business that's doing well, and basically you're doing everything you can to keep the trains running on time and defending your status. That shifts to a dangerous period that we call successful stagnation. This typically lasted for decades. If you were the market leader, you had a real, lonely spot at the top of the mountain, and you could ride on that for a while. And that's just not the case. There's still successful stagnation. It doesn't last as long as it used to. Firm exit and entry rates are much higher than they've ever been. The average time for an organization to be on the S&P 500 is declining. 15 years ago, the average lifetime was something around 25 years. Today it's 15, and 6 or 7 years expected to be 3 or 4, which means the company comes out of nowhere, becomes the top 500 performers or indexers, and then disappears off the S&P in a 4 to 5 year period. So we're talking radical transformation that's going on. And so the key on this, for both to think about businesses in your community, and especially what we found in what we call monoculture communities, are in very dangerous territory. Those are communities where there's one either giant manufacturer or a giant type of manufacturing. So Detroit is the obvious one, where they're kind of a monoculture town entirely devoted to automotive automobile production. When that changes, it's incredibly destructive. So again, this is the notion you have to be diverse. That divergency is really important. Otherwise, what happens is when the disruption occurs, you get in desperate decline, and then you have a demise. And so the real importance on this, as we know, is you want to maintain your success rate. You want to make sure that you're thinking divergently, employing people with different ideas, experimenting all the time, listening to consumers more. All those things play a part so you don't get stuck in successful stagnation. And so this is just, the last slide here is just my email address. And I really went through this fast, so we had some time for questions and discussion. But if you have any questions, I believe the presentation's available on the ACC website, but if you need it, I'll be happy to email it to you. And then if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask me offline, this is my contact address. So with that, I'll stop talking a bit and see if there's questions, comments, or other insights that you have about the presentation.
Tanja, it's John. Just to confirm, we do have the slides available, or they will be available along with the audio on the Emergers site, correct?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do. Once we finish wrapping everything up, I'll have it posted in the next day or so. Sure will.
Great. So we've got some time for questions. Anybody has some thoughts? Michael, I assume these slides are somewhat proprietary, but are you comfortable with us sharing them with board members? I've got some really interesting stuff in here that I think some of our key leadership would like to see.
Definitely, yeah. We built them so they could be shared with whomever you want, and we're certainly welcome to do that. So share away.
Okay, so where my head's going, John and Mike and whoever else is on the call, is when I came here 12 years ago, and I've been in the industry, this is my 30th year, and I said, you know, when I'm not relevant anymore, the day I walk away, because my biggest concern is I'm going to be some crotchety old fart, and I don't want to be a person, and I want to stay, you know, vibrant. I want to be energized. I want to be one of those people that is insightful and willing to adapt my ways to create the best possible organization. And things, you know, they are changing, and that can be a healthy place to be. What are some of the warning signs you're seeing as far as people who have some years under their belt to stay away from, or things to consider to stay that vibrant, energetic, insightful, forward-thinking person?
Yeah. Well, that's the eternal problem. It's a great question. And we see this, I will tell you, we see this across, I do a lot of executive leadership work with Fortune 500 companies and international companies. This is a constant refrain on this. One of the things, it's what I mentioned in the millennial comments, some of the millennial comments that we heard that were worrisome to me, is that you're waiting for this very dynamic, internet-driven generation to conform to how you've behaved. So that's a warning sign to me. What you want to do is embrace. I talk about this, is even in your organization or in your community, find the aliens. Have something for them to find a way to not talk to them, try to get them to become members, but understand more what they're wrestling with. I'll give you a good example. I live in, I'm in upstate New York, and I'm in a small town. I have different locations, but my primary house is in Hudson, New York. And I talk to people here around, you know, we have a lot of, this is 2 hours north of New York City. We've got a lot of internet companies and small startups in town, none of which are members of the chamber, some of which are members of the chamber because of insurance, and that's it. And when I asked them about it, they said, well, the only thing they keep asking for is to be a member to, you know, to spend money in their print directory. And they're like, there's no relationship I don't want anyone in town even coming into my place because I run an international mobile business or whatever. And so one of the things is what we find all the time is going after new members or different generations of members using the same techniques or the same approaches that have worked in the past. Trying to fit, you know, fit them into your system into trying to understand what their needs are. So one of the ways we can keep from being stuck is not saying, we'll wait for them. They need to understand what we offer. We're in the driver's seat. You have to recognize to go out and have conversations, have interviews, create a social situation that they want to engage in. There's lots of competitors popping up across the landscape that are millennial driven, and we also saw this with social media that people are looking for solutions and they're building their own groups. So I think, you know, one of the things to recognize is not think you always come after with the same solutions that worked in the past. Have conversations with people who are non-members to understand what their needs are. People in your organization find and listen to people who have different ideas on that, and you know, keep engaging and experimenting. I think is really important. If that helped at all.
I agree. I think what's challenging about this discussion for me is, and I do a lot of reading and research, I'm your introvert that's been conformed to an extroverted world, is the baby boomer generation. I think we're looking for the quick solutions. You know, I'll just be honest. You entered the chamber world 30 years ago. If you followed a certain pattern of success, you could get there. I mean, and it really, hard work, but anybody could do it if they were willing to work hard. I think with the organizations of the future, there is no box that you can open and say, follow steps 1 through 10, and you're going to run a successful organization. And I think that's what's challenging, is how do we create the toolkit, the methodology for the future, and how do we, because we need to shape it now, or it's going to be out of control in 15, 20 years. And I'm not saying that we should control it, but like from a bad perspective, but what is that thought process of shaping and forecasting and preparing for the future when organizations are changing so fast?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things that I talk about that's important is what I call lateral leadership. And lateral leadership is the notion that what you have to understand now is there's a moment to be divergent. And what I mean by divergent is exactly what you talked about: thinking out of the box, multiple solutions, open to new ideas, being creative. What's interesting is we can measure divergent thinking. It's actually something that your brain, that we can measure in anybody's path. What they find around divergence that will be interesting to you maybe is that the people who arrive at divergent solutions the fastest as a group, interestingly, are people who have lived abroad for a specific number of years. And the point being is, it's not when you lived abroad in another country, in another culture, what happens to your brain is that you have to develop a whole new set of neural pathways. So however you grew up, you know what it's like to go to dinner and what you do with your napkin and opening the door for people, and when to ask to use the bathroom, when that's appropriate, all those types of things. You go to a different culture, you have to learn all that over again. And what we found is people, when they have that, have the ability to tap into that different neural network, which allows them to have divergent thinking. What that means is, for all of us, is we're all capable of having divergent thinking and being better at it. It means that you need to open yourself up to new experiences. So exactly to your point, when you're a person who's been in the same industry for 30 or 45 years, and you're the expert, but that expertise doesn't necessarily guarantee your predictive ability of what's going on anymore. But there's also convergent thinking, and convergent thinking, efficiency and management and check-ins and protocol, and that doesn't mean divergence is more important than convergent thinking. But what happened is the last really 200 years, especially the last 125 years of American industry, has been on convergent. I have an idea, I build it, I become the most efficient at it, I become the best distributor at it. I'm playing this game where I have to do better on margin with my competitors. That doesn't matter as much anymore. It is who comes up with the idea, how fast can I make it spread, and I'm going to worry about how to make it efficient later. And you see this this lateral leadership model, it really is personified in Netflix, where Netflix started by being a disruptor to Blockbuster, and then they were divergent, and then they had to be convergent. How do we email DVDs as efficiently as possible? Then that business got disrupted by streaming. So they had to be divergent and say, how do we become the most powerful streamer? And I'll tell you that 1/3 of all the bandwidth in the United States is consumed by Netflix. So they were successful becoming a large streaming organization, which was convergent again. Then they lost the ability to get content licensing, so they had to become divergent again and become a TV and movie producer. And so to the point of that story is, what you have to think about is, when do you dial up diversity? When do you enable brainstorming, creativity, different ways of functioning? And then when are you convergent? How do you, once you find those ideas, make them efficient, make them operational, make them scale? And you have to dial back and forth in that situation. And it's much more art than science. But that's really what's perplexing business leadership, and I'm sure leadership at the chamber as well, is when, if you're really, really good at running an association, that won't get you as far as it used to.
Pam or Jen, Kelly, any?
This is Pam. I've really been interested in the conversation going on here, but I'm always wondering from the leadership role of whether it's my position or just even volunteer leaders, is because of we're in I'm in Colorado, just south of Denver, and a very fast-growing population that's going on, and we're getting so bombarded by negativity, mainly on social media, and to try to continue at whether myself as trying to organize and get everybody on the same page, but even trying to handle my volunteer leadership to not be so to get into the realm of people talking negatively about community, about the business and things like that. And so I'm curious, in any of your studies, and you talked a little bit about social media earlier, but is there something within your studies that really kind of talks towards that, and how you stay, I guess, a bigger person rather than getting into the mud with some of the negativity?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things, this is a hallmark of what we're seeing. One of the decline of institutions. So of course you saw, that city that I talked about, which is the rise of peer-to-peer, right? So, a good example of this is even in the last election, where people trust whatever. If your friend posts something on Facebook, you're more inclined to trust that than you are from, say, the Denver Post or something. And that's a huge shift. And it's created, not everyone's operating from the same point of view. It's hard to not operating from the same set of facts. So point of view is trumping facts and kind of the dialogue. And so what you get in, and this is a left or right paradigm, it's that people use whatever they can just to throw mud at each other. And to your point, what we found is, though, within all of that, there's a real hunger for events and gatherings. So one of the things to think about on this is, while all that negativity is going on, when you're made visible, right, when you're participating and you're a person in a room, it's a lot different. And people are really hungry for those. And you've got the kind of vitriolic mudslingers on either political spectrum side, but also just inherently. But what people are really hungry for are connective experiences. What we found is and this is true of businesses, and this is something to really think about, is understand the events business. Events can be a business, but also how do you create a space that is inviting, that people want to participate in? It might be knowledge-based, whatever those things are, but increasingly in a world where you're constantly bombarded with information and online, people are really will pay for, actually, and are looking for resonant offline experiences. And if you can become the place that does that, you're creating a natural constituency for both your organization and for those interactions. And we see a decline. The more events that people have and the more engagement, the more you have champions of having civil discourse. So that's something that I think is important to explore. And it's not necessarily like the coffee after work or whatever, but what are the things that you can really push yourself into understanding powerful events that allow people to have real communication ability in an offline forum.
Okay.
One last question, anybody? Michael, thank you. Very helpful. I've retained a copy of the slides that you sent after the board meeting at ACC, and it's been a great refresher for me. So I appreciate you taking the time today. And for everybody on the call, remember to check back on the Emerger site, and we'll have the audio and the PowerPoint up there.
Great.
All right, thanks.